When we speak of the astral body and the astral plane, it's such a vast, quite complicated subject when we consider it esoterically, and I'm not going to go into all the facets of that today, because when we talk about the astral plane, it's a combination of our personal psychological makeup, as we've discussed with Cancer, and the connection to archetypes and the psychic substrate that the Jungians work with. These are parts of our psychic astral patterns that have co-evolved with the physiology of the body. So there's the natural component of it there, but there's also these other things on the astral plane. It's the dream space. It's where there can be focused astral forms from dark magic. This is where we can get some of the demonology stuff, and there's also elemental forces, the Deva forces on the INVOlutionary arc. So there's all kinds of things that we can see on the astral plane. Earthbound souls as well, and people say they see ghosts. They're not necessarily malevolent, but these sorts of things. So the astral plane is a very complicated and rich subject, but what I want to focus on today is how working with the soul affects the astral body, and what does this mean at an individual level for the integration of the astral body, doing psychological work. Of course, I've mentioned many a time Jungian work, the dream work, as a really great tool for working with astral information in terms of psychological work and bringing about the synthesis of aspects of the psyche so that the personality can become more whole, and being able to touch in the sexuality stuff as well, using sex and relationship as a way to work with that as well, in terms of the purification of the human being and making sure that the personality is really well brought together, so that we don't have these aspects of the psyche that have subversive will to power problems as a result of being rejected, or the trauma, or the abandonment, whatever. So it's important for that reason. But how, when we're working with the soul, does it get differentiated from, let's say, someone not working with the soul but who's doing intense psychological work? Because there is quite a key difference. So this is what we'll talk about today. As we discuss this today, we will be retouching on many issues already discussed, because of course these things are all connected in with one another, right? So we often circulate back to certain themes and just get different geometric angles on these different problems or procedures. So with the astral stuff, we're really looking at some of the Taurus Scorpio theme there, because we have the astral body in its concentrated form, really representing the desire nature of the individual. Mars is connected to the astral body, 6th ray, and the solar plexus. So when we're working with the soul, when we get to the 2nd degree initiation, now this is a relatively advanced point of development, by the way, because it speaks to when the soul is, there's enough connection to the soul and the personality has enough receptivity to the soul for it to actually plunge into the body and start to take control over the astral nature. This is why this is said to be the longest and most difficult initiation. This is where we have to go through all of the collective karmic problems inherited with the moon, with what the moon represents there, and it takes the longest time before we get to working with the 3rd initiation, where it's mental. So there's a lot to it, but you know, this is the true dark night of the soul in this sense. But there are also many people who report these sorts of dark nights of the soul experience, where they go through dark periods of depression and meeting these challenges and going through some degree of a rebirthing, scorpionic, even Piscean experience, more scorpionic, I guess, at an exoteric level, but they're not necessarily working with the soul. So what's the difference then? What is the difference? Psychologically, the psyche itself can go through many transformations. This is why Cancer is also the lesser known sign of death, because the moon, and if we look at the really old first matriarchal, more matriarchal or more nature worshipping origin societies, more societies, I guess, cultures, these are working with the nature process of death and regeneration. And we see that with the menstrual cycle and its connection to the moon. There's kind of a death that happens every month in the female body, and this is why we see some of these old, more archaic from our current, rational perception, archaic kinds of rituals where there's a sacrifice to the Great Mother. Point being that this process of death and regeneration is naturally a part of nature. And so from a psychological point of view, we can go through all kinds of death and rebirth processes. When people lose a loved one, that's a universal human experience. We go through grief. We have to go through those are the 5 stages, right, of dealing with grief, anger, denial, and acceptance. And so the psyche is in its own nature able to go through these death and regenerative kinds of experiences. When we're working with the soul, it's the same kind of thing, but it's just multiplied 100-fold. So it's way more intensive, it's way more complete, and it's also both deeply personal and also impersonal, because we start penetrating things that we've inherited from other lifetimes. So it can get to a point where, yes, there can be things that rise that have a personal story connected to them, but they feel so much deeper than just what we've experienced in our life, where it seems to go beyond something that we can specifically anchor on, like, oh, my childhood wound or something like that. And ancestral stuff as well, all of this, to whatever degree there's a connection between whatever ancestry we choose to incarnate into, and how that becomes a point of anchoring for past karmic patterns and all of this. So it becomes way more intensive. But also, here's my main point for this video. When we're working with the soul, there is a specific process that we have to work with of polarizing into the future. And this necessarily aggregates the astral, because it's all of that which is the past, and it's all of that which is moving in its congregate forms with an absence of consciousness, to all of that stuff that's been accumulated on the involutionary arc of getting deeper and deeper and deeper into matter. From the point of unconsciousness. So when we start working with the soul, it brings about the drag, and this is really perfectly encapsulated by the Taurian problem. And as we've mentioned, Taurus is the sign that rules the world disciple at large. So it means that what's described in that dualistic push and pull Taurus problem, the reorienting of the desire nature, which is Taurus Scorpio axis, that speaks to everyone working with the soul, because it's a universal problem of what happens when the soul comes into being. And when we start working with the soul, the reorientation of the personal desire into that collective desire, Taurus, Uranus falling as the collective serving planet, in exaltation in Scorpio, all of this. But it's a tricky thing to know, when do we need to apply the plutonic force of getting into astral substance to understand it more, to penetrate it, to reveal it and work with it, psychological work, versus when we need to get our attention off the astral body. Because this is what DK says, by the way. Get your attention off the astral body and focus on the soul, service, getting into the work. Because they kind of feel like two contradictory movements, don't they? Because if we want to purify the astral body, we necessarily have to kind of deal with it and go into it. But then we're working with the soul, and okay, apparently we have to go against the astral body or ignore it. And so this is where there's a tension between the path of occultism or occult discipleship, solarization, and some variations, not all, but some variations of a more mystical path of orientation. DK makes an interesting point, and I love when I read the books when there's a certain category that I hadn't considered before, because I'd come to that awareness of what he ends up describing in the book, but didn't necessarily have a word or a phrase to categorize. I go, oh, that's so great. But he talks about something called the will to peace versus the will to good. And the will to peace is a positive step on the journey of evolution, but it's an astral form in nature. So people who are working with healing or spirituality or meditation or whatever, it can be other things in life, even just having a positive family life or whatever, when they're moving with the will to peace, the urge is towards creating a sense of contentment and harmony and balance. And of course, that's a good thing, because that can still move someone away from an unconscious, rampant pursuit of desire in a materialistic way. And then actually that wasn't satisfying after all. I just want contentment. And then some of the Eastern stuff really gets that really well, right? It's like just the calm waters of life and the middle way and all of these sorts of things. But it's the motivation at the individual level is to feel contentment. And that is still fundamentally about me and how I feel. So it's astrally motivated alone. The will to good is when we start responding to not just our need for balance and psychic wholeness and contentment, but collective needs, or rather instead focusing on collective needs. And they become more important than the personal needs. So when we're working with the will to good, so starting to work with the solar principle, we're responding more to the collective needs. So this is what categorizes moving into the stage of aspirants, and the aspirants then moving into discipleship, where there's a bit more of a thorough merging with the soul happening when we get to the angle of disciple aspirants leading up to the soul and orienting the personality towards the soul. So it's this thing of, where do I stay and work on my psychological problems, and where do I need to polarize into will and push against the aggravation and the resistance of the astral? So it's quite a subtle balance here, because there is a certain point, and I've experienced this a lot myself, where there's necessarily a time to be digging in the plutonic way and like, oh, there's a really weird complex showing up here. Why am I doing that? Versus when there's just a point where there's stagnation, resistance, and where the astral body itself starts to kind of get a bit too much attention, and it starts to circulate on negativity, and then it becomes really aggressive, negative, self-destructive, depressive. Remember, this is also a quality experienced in Taurus at the individual level as well. It's like it's like the inversion of the will principle, where if you're not moving forward properly, it kind of turns back in on itself, and it gets really frustrated. So when we get to these points, we have to polarize into action and into will. So this is why sometimes people with a slightly more will to peace oriented mystical bent, or even some people that speak about the feminine processes to whatever degree, we say the lunar mysteries are connected to the psyche and going into the body and dealing with your emotions and becoming emotionally literate, which by the way is all important, and from a collective level, culturally speaking, we're not good with these things. So we do have to go into the astral realm and become more educated about the lunar qualities of our human experience, so that we know how to express emotions intelligently, and all of these sorts of things. So that's important. But when we are working with the soul, there gets a point where you need to be able to tell the difference between when you need to go into something and deal with it, and work out the complex, work with the dream, work with the Mars plutonic tests. If you've got a conflict going on in your life that's reflecting the warped consciousness, right? Which is getting into the Maya, versus, okay, now I'm just stuck and stagnant and getting negative or getting frustrated, or I don't know where else to go. Got to move into will. And that necessarily creates the tension, and it's not necessarily comfortable. But that is the fundamental difference between those two movements. And I have seen people sometimes, from that more astral oriented point of view, criticize some of these will-based movements as a kind of psychological masculine resistance, in a way, where they interpret this will thing as being somewhat aggressive or negative or exclusive of the body, or exclusive of the psychological needs. And you can see how that would work, right? Because if you're working with a personal will, and you can see it's a bit more of the masculine imbalance in the culture, like I'm going to personally develop myself and just go, go, go. But you do that at the expense of the feminine quality of the needs, and also the deeper insight into your subjective nature, then it becomes a problem. But that's very different from occult will, or working with the upper centers, or moving with the reality of the spiritual principle. Because in this case, it's love that's penetrating, not the lower Martian, masculine dominant, or mentally dominant, concrete mental dominant will. Moving with love is very different. So to some degree, the collective issue with the masculine psychologically can create this confusion between these two principles here. Because there's obviously a difference between the will of the soul versus the will of the personality, and exerting a kind of dominating force, which actually is astrally motivated, right? In any case, it's the will to power or something, but it's more of a masculine turn of that spiral, as opposed to the feminine nurturing sensitivity to the interior realms and all of this. So I've meandered off into a few different directions, but I'm just making this point here where, and it's a little bit similar to the striving and surrender thing. Where do you surrender to like the problems that you're facing right now, and embrace your humanity and work with what you've got in front of you, and just stay humble to the immediate here and now, versus when do you step into willful action, polarizing into a level of consciousness that is currently out of your reach psychically from the personality angle? Because that's occult discipleship, right? That you have to see the future. It's a Sagittarian aspiration. You see the goal, you're like, oh man, okay, that's my next level. that really doesn't feel good, because you're pushing against the past and you're pushing against the limited consciousness of the body in its astral congregation, Mars lunar problems, seeing that and having to, and that's where it's uncomfortable. And that's the similar thing with, developing your strength. If you're working out in the gym or something, it's like pushing that next rep. So we consider here consciousness or working with the soul like a muscle that needs to be worked out, and there's two different directions it can go. It's the evolutionary angle and the involutionary angle, and really we work with both as occult disciples. We have to, because we have to go into form to work out what's going on and to synthesize the personality. That's how Virgo, the divine mother sign, quickens the process of the evolutionary quality, right? It's Libra, understanding the law, connecting to the higher self, coming into Virgo and the quickening of those processes, versus moving into will, polarization into purpose, higher angle of Taurus and Sagittarius and all of these sorts of things here. So it's just a matter of, in terms of discerning where you're at and what do you need to do, you really look at what is the nature of the struggle in your current life circumstance. So you bring it back to the here and now, and maybe it starts off as going, I just feel inert and I'm stuck. I'm not sure what to do. So in that case, if nothing's really obviously rising up from the unconscious to be dealt with, or like, unconscious, deep grief or some trauma or something, if nothing's really moving, polarize into will. And you keep moving with that. And when you get to a point where something needs to be approached in an involutionary way, and to go into the healing or go into the more feminine aspect or the lunar mystery process, psychological process, that will come up because you're polarizing into a greater level of consciousness. Will get to the point where it pushes up against whatever is in the unconscious psyche that's holding you into a lot of resistance. So they work together actually, but it's the same thing that I've said several times about the sleeping dragon. It's like the sleeping dragon is that psychological thing that you need to regenerate, but you need to have enough polarization into consciousness that's currently beyond you, into a level of operation that's currently beyond you, before you wake that up. So you go, okay, bigger, 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 okay, I'm getting there, and then there's the dragon. You go, and this is my mother complex, like, or whatever it is, or this is the fear of judgment or the rejection or a cultural attitude that's still latent in my psyche or something. So it's just a matter of being able to see that these two angles, they feel contradictory because they are, in terms of the directions that they go, the directions of consciousness. One's evolutionary and one's involutionary. But when we're working with the soul, we're going evolutionary as the general motion, because that's the turn of the spiral. We're working towards the soul, and then that brings on the lunar mysteries or the hidden divine mother intelligence as we polarize into evolution. Because remember, Virgo nourishes and protects and gestates the Christ child. Okay, when matter is now being worked with the consciousness principle, that's the opposite in Pisces there, or whatever, right? So got to push, and do that which is uncomfortable, and then that will necessarily bring that up. So it's just that thing where we don't want to fall into a second-ray mystical trap of all inclusion, or worrying too much about, but what feels good, and if it doesn't feel good, then I must need to heal or come back to contentment or something, because that's the will to peace. Some people are working with the will to peace, and that's fine. It's a necessarily evolutionary step, but this is not going to serve us when we're working with the soul. And if we keep trying to get back to feeling okay and comfortable in our lives, it's just not going to happen, because at a certain point when you're working with the soul, the only thing that becomes truly satisfying is merging with the consciousness. This is the true intimacy, the true union, merging and going deeper and deeper into love, into the divine self. So you're just going to have to cop the shit, basically, and we all have to do that to some extent, because when we're bringing in the new future, it's transitional period as well, moving into the Aquarian age, it's just going to be pulling it's just uncomfortable. It's like giving birth, right? The woman right at that point of having to push that out. It's a beautiful process, a new life's coming through, but it's not comfortable. So if we can accept that from the outset, and then appreciate evolutionary and involutionary processes, and see where sometimes we may be falling into balance into one direction or the other, and when we might need to make the switch. Okay, we've done enough involutionary psychological work, now we're going to make a push, grow to the next level of consciousness. Okay, now I'm getting exhausted and there's a lot of resistance coming up, and there are pains and things in the unconscious, the sleeping dragons are coming up. Now we go back into the involutionary processes. Okay, well, I think that's all. I think that's the essence of what I wanted to get to today, but Thank you for watching. I'll see you next time.